Welcome, everyone, and thank you for participating in the Request for Proposal webinar for the COVID-19 Housing Assistance Program. I'm Diane Elias, and I will be presenting along with Nancy Urbanski. We both work at Minnesota Housing and manage programs that provide housing assistance in order to prevent or end homelessness. This session will be recorded and posted on our website, so you're able to access this information again if needed. We will leave time at the end of the session for questions. When answering questions, know that they are preliminary answers on our part. We will post final answers as part of a frequently asked questions, also known as an FAQ on our website for this program. Please remember to mute your phone during the session. It is the orange button that looks like a microphone. And please remember not to put us on hold, as that could trigger hold music that will disrupt this webinar. Some of you may be new to GoTo technology, so I'll explain some of the toolbar options that will be useful today, because there will be a Q&A session after the presentation. There are two options for asking questions. The toolbar on the upper right-hand side of your screen allows you to ask questions using the questions feature, which I have shown on my screen in the orange box. At any time during the webinar, you can type your question and click the send button. The question you send will land in a queue for us, and we'll be able to answer them during the Q&A session. In the red rectangle is the hand raising feature. When you click the hand icon, it's the same as raising your hand as if you were in an in-person audience. We can call on you verbally and unmute your phone line so that you can speak to the panelists. Everyone on today's broadcast will hear the dialogue through the webinar audio. Today we'll call on audience members as we see hands being raised. You also have two options for listening to the presentation, which I have indicated with the blue box. You can listen through your computer, and if you choose this option, I recommend using headphones to get the clearest broadcast. Listening through your computer may limit your ability to speak to us during the Q&A, because some computers aren't equipped with microphones. If you'd like to speak during the Q&A, you can switch to the telephone option at any time during the presentation. If you choose to listen using telephone, a dial-in number, access code, and audio PIN will be provided. The audio PIN is required if you plan on using the hand-raising feature, and that is so we can unmute your line during the Q&A session. So Minnesota Housing has a mission, which is to provide access to safe, decent, affordable housing and build stronger communities across the state by offering products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. Minnesota Housing also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both the financing and long-term asset management of projects and developments. The agency has pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. So next you will see our agenda. We will provide an overview of the COVID-19 Housing Assistance Program, also known as CHAP, and then we will get into the details of the program itself and cover the review criteria and scoring. We will then talk about the application submission, the timeline, and then end the session with your questions. So the goal of the COVID-19 Housing Assistance Program is to assist individuals and families in Minnesota to prevent homelessness and help them to maintain their housing during the public health related emergency. Many of you may have been a part of the earlier legislative request where we were requesting funds for this program in a different form, and both legislative sessions ended without resolution or funding for this program. As a result, we did do an application to apply for funds through the Federal CARES Act, and the Federal CARES Act funds were available through the state of Minnesota, and we were provided an allocation through that program. So the Coronavirus Relief Fund is the fund that I mentioned that comes to us through the CARES Act. The funds will be awarded to administrators throughout Minnesota in this competitive RFP process. The funds are available, and we expect the program to begin August 10th and December 30th of 2020. We will have up to $100 million available in funds. Additional funds may become available, and if that happens, they will be awarded either through this process or a subsequent round of funding. All expenses must be incurred between March 1st, 2020 and December 30th, and they are for past due bills only. Expenses that have already been paid by an applicant, such as a city, county, tribe, or other entity to pay a household's bills, are not eligible. For example, if the city provided funding to its constituents for rent in the month of June and paid for these costs, there is not a way to reimburse the costs that were already paid. However, the funds can be used for households who have past due bills that have not yet been paid. The eligible applicants for the program include Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program grantees or subgrantees, federally recognized Minnesota tribes, local government, including cities, counties, public housing agencies, or housing redevelopment authorities, and nonprofit or community-based organizations who have the capacity to administer rent or mortgage assistance. I want to point out that administrators must serve households from the entire geographic area they are covering and not just their existing renters or clients. I also want to clarify that for-profit entities are not eligible to apply under this funding because they do not meet the federal definition of a community-based organization. To be eligible for this assistance, households must be residents of Minnesota and can be a homeowner or renter with incomes up to 300% of the federal poverty guidelines. For renters, preference will be given to households who are at or below 200% of federal poverty guidelines. They also must have a housing-related payment, such as a rent that's past due, mortgage that's past due, or utility or other expense that has been incurred after March 1st, 2020. Finally, households must be unable to pay the amount owed because of a COVID-related public health emergency, such as unemployment, illness, or other COVID-19 related issue. There are two program activities that are eligible. One is housing expense payments. This will be the majority of the budget. The other expense category is administration and cannot exceed 15% of the total request. For the category of housing expense payments, they include rent payment, mortgage payment, including those for manufactured homes, manufactured park lot rents, contract for deed payments, utility payments, association fees, homeowners insurance, and other related costs approved by Minnesota Housing. If you expect to have other housing-related costs that are not specifically identified in the prior slide and on this slide, you will want to be sure to include those expenses on the application budget. Please note that generally speaking, property taxes are not an eligible expense. However, exceptions may be made by grantees in cases that would prevent foreclosure. Funds must be paid directly to the entity to whom the money is owed, such as a landlord, utility company, or financial service provider, or other entity who owns the mortgage. Payment cannot be made directly to the household. Up to 15% of the funding can be requested for administrative expenses. You'll want to pay attention to this percentage because if you request more than 15%, you could lose points on your application. Administrative expenses can be used to process program applications, verify eligibility, and administer payment. Costs for staff to negotiate with landlords or mortgage companies would be included in this category as well, and also marketing or outreach.
Good morning, everyone. This is Nancy Urbanski with Minnesota Housing, and I will now review with you the application and the scoring criteria. So under capacity and equity, I'll start with households served. And with households served, we're not looking as much at the number of households you're proposing to serve, but rather at your capacity to serve them. So this includes the staffing needed to conduct the intake and verify eligibility, and the administrative capacity to administer funds and comply with reporting requirements. When completing the household served by month on the application, you'll want to think about the time it will take to be operational and disperse funds, and then take this timeline into account when you're projecting the number of households that first month. Finally, you'll want to demonstrate your experience working with landlords, property owners, and with households in need of this type of assistance. You'll see that there is a large focus on equity in this application. I will go into further detail when we get to the scoring methodology slide, but for now I'll just say here that on the application we want to know about the demographics of the population that you intend to serve, your ability to provide culturally specific marketing, access, and services to that population, as well as your experience working with households in need of emergency assistance and navigating resources, including government assistance. We also want to know the geographic boundaries of the intended service area. For some of you, it may be a neighborhood, it could be a county, a city, or any other region. It could be multiple counties. So we just want you to describe that on your application. And we want to know your experience working with similar programs, and also what your capacity is to be operational, including whether you will need time to implement new systems, or if you need additional time to hire and train staff, or perhaps reassign staff from other areas in your organization. And then finally, we want to know what your experience is administering similar programs in addition to administering federal funds. The budget request is pretty straightforward. We're really looking at the amount that you're requesting, and then the specific expense categories. So for many of you, it may be all. For some of you, if you have an expertise in one or two areas, I'll use mortgage assistance as an example. You may just be checking that type of assistance. And you'll want to keep in mind, if you are limiting the types of assistance that you're offering, it's an opportunity to think about having discussions and collaborating with other providers in your service area, because we will be taking into consideration the types of funding assistance. We do want to see that all are being provided to all Minnesotans throughout the state. And then with the budget narrative, it's a very simple question. We ask, what else do you want us to know about your budget? And from a reviewer's mindset, and the reviewers are the ones that are scoring the applications, this is the opportunity to provide any additional detail that may not be answered on the budget. So if a reviewer is needing or wanting more clarity, really, I encourage you to take advantage of this question and provide any additional detail or clarity that you feel may be needed. And then we also want to know what your timeline will be to be operational, as well as what the timeline will be for you to issue funds to the recipient. In this case, recipient includes not only landlords or mortgage companies, for example, but if you have subgrantees, it also includes how long will it take for you to issue funds to your subgrantees. There may be situations where Providers may need more than 1 or 2 weeks to be operational, and there is an opportunity on this application for you to provide a detailed explanation. It won't necessarily be counted against you if you're not operational within that 2 weeks. However, we really want to understand why that is and how long it will take for you to be able to be operational and distribute funds to recipients. The application has 3 scoring categories. The application has a total of 100 possible points. 50 of those points are in the capacity category. We want to know what your staff and administrative capacity is to serve the proposed number of households, as well as the administrative capacity to comply with the reporting requirements and to administer the funds. And Diane will go into this in detail a little bit later, but there will be a monthly reporting requirement. So we want you to think about that and the timeliness of getting those reports into us. It will be an important consideration when scoring this application. We also want to understand what your experience is in working with landlords and property owners, as well as households in need of this assistance, the timeline to disperse funds to the recipient, and your experience with similar programs, including administering federal programs and the implementation of new systems or personnel. And again, I talked about that a little bit earlier, but what does that look like for you? The second section is equity, and this is a total of 30 points. We want to see you demonstrate your ability to provide culturally appropriate services to households that are disparately impacted through housing disparities. And so we want to know about what your marketing access will look like, and this is an opportunity for you to think about, do you need materials that are translated into different languages, and what does that outreach look like to you for your intended populations? We also want to know what your existing relationships and experience are in assisting households in need of emergency housing assistance, as well as your experience in assisting households with navigating government assistance and resources. Finally, the budget is worth 20 points. I talked about the budget a little bit earlier, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but again, just stressing that we want that narrative to answer any questions that we have about the budget that may not be clear in the budget. And then a last reminder, I know Diane said this, is make sure you do the math on the administration, because if you do ask for more than 15%, you will lose points on that section. And lastly, I will say that in addition to application scoring, the review committee will also evaluate the scores in conjunction with the program's strategic priorities and the breadth of assistance types that are available. And again, assistance types are all of the eligible expenses being provided for that geographic area. So we will be looking at that and wanting to really look at statewide coverage, because that is an important priority for this funding. And then finally, the applicant's ability to address equity and community need.
Thank you, Nancy. This is Diane. I will now cover the submission of the application and the timeline. So the following 3 documents must be submitted with your application in order to be considered for funding. I can't emphasize enough the importance of submitting the right documents with the right information. On the day that we receive the applications, our staff must ensure that the application meets the threshold criteria. This is before we read applications in their entirety and before we pass them on to reviewers to score them. Everyone should highlight these bullets, because if you do not complete one of these tasks, your application could be rejected even before it is reviewed. So as you can see on the list, we have the application with signature page, the current financial documentation, and affirmative action certification. Those are the documents that need to be submitted with the application. So for the affirmative action certification, if your response to this solicitation is or could be in excess of $100,000, you need to complete the State of Minnesota Affirmative Action Certification. You'll need to determine if you're subject to the Minnesota Rights Act, because that will tell you whether or not you need to complete this form. And in addition, you also need to provide documentation of compliance if the box that you check on the form indicates that step. For the financial documentation, if you're a non-governmental entity and applying, you'll need to provide us with financial statements. The type of financial statements you provide is related to your agency's overall budget. It isn't the amount that you're applying for. Rather, the financial statements are how much the applicant agency has in total gross revenue in any given year. And this table outlines what types of documents you would provide as a result of that amount. The submission deadline is Wednesday, July 22nd at 2:00 p.m. There are 2 steps to submit the entire application. The first is to submit the application and the application signature page using the online tool at the following link. This is also available in the RFP instructions and on our website. The second step is to submit the financial documents and affirmative action form using Minnesota Housing's secure upload tool. After you submit your application and signature page through the CVent link, you'll receive a reminder and instructions on how to submit the financial and affirmative action certification form, and a link for that will be provided. So the RFP timeline, as we mentioned, is quite short. We issued the RFP on Tuesday, July 14th. We're holding the information session today, and applications are due next Wednesday, July 22nd at 2 p.m. We do expect that we will make recommendations to Minnesota Housing Board by August 3rd, and award letters will be issued shortly after that. After that point, when you receive an award letter, we will then have a due diligence webinar, which is mandatory for all applicants who have been awarded funds. And the due diligence process will begin, which involves having you submit to us additional materials that are needed to complete the grant process. As Nancy mentioned, there will also be reporting that will be required as part of this grant. Grantees will submit reports to Minnesota Housing on a monthly basis, so applicants will want to make sure they have that internal capacity to track the data that's required on an ongoing basis throughout the grant term. In large part, these reports will consist of an expenditure report based on the budget that has been submitted, as well as the number of households that have been served through the program. Other data and information may be required, and that will be highlighted during the due diligence webinar. All funds must be expended by December 30th, 2020, and the final report will be due to Minnesota Housing on January 8th. I want to tell you a little bit about the due diligence expectations, because if you are awarded funds, it's helpful to be ready to know what the expectations will be for submitting documents to us. So once awarded, you will be asked to submit a grant contract. It will utilize DocuSign, and Minnesota Housing will initiate that signing process. You would also submit what we call the work plan with budget. That's really just a repeated action of how you filled out the table related to the household served in the application, as well as the table or budget that you've submitted with the application. And so you'll have a form that you'll fill out that will just be adjusting your numbers and your budget in accordance with what the award turns out to be. Many times when we make awards, it's not necessarily for the full amount that is requested, and so agencies should consider how they would adjust these numbers if the funding is not the same as what they applied for. We typically like to see that you follow whatever the spirit of your application was. So if you're intending to serve a certain number of households, you might want to adjust your budget accordingly and in proportion to the award amount. There's also an electronic funds transfer authorization form, and that will need to be submitted as well so that your organization can receive payment. So if you're new to the state of Minnesota as a vendor, you'll need to register with the vendor registration link. Once the form is completed, you'll provide Minnesota Housing with your vendor number and send us a copy of your W-9 so that payments will not be delayed. Instructions on how to complete these forms are provided on the back page of each document. Minnesota Housing electronically deposits funds with your agency's financial institution, and it's using the disbursement schedule that we will indicate in your contract. If you've not registered as a vendor before, this all needs to be completed prior to completing the electronic funds transfer authorization form. So these steps are going to set yourself up through the vendor registration link and making sure to send us the information with your vendor number and W-9 are the steps that you'll want to complete before you submit the electronic transfer form. If you're a current vendor and your account information has not changed, then you do not need to register through the vendor registration link. However, if your account information has changed, you may need to submit an updated electronic funds transfer authorization form. And if your account information remains the same, it's possible that no action would be required. It's important to note that these funds are federal funds, and there's an expectation that the applicant would comply with federal requirements. The U.S. Treasury does update their guidance for the CARES Act funds on a regular basis, so you'll want to become familiar with their website. As an example of a federal requirement that might be triggered, if the funds are at a certain amount and you meet the threshold, you may be required to follow the Single Audit Act, which is a different type of audit than what your organization might be used to conducting. We recommend that applicants consult with their own accountants and their own legal counsel regarding the federal requirements. We will now answer any questions that you may have. As mentioned previously, you can ask questions using the question box or the hand raising feature on your GoTo Toolbar, and we'll attempt to answer the questions in the order they come in. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible, but if some questions remain unanswered after the webinar time, we'll email responses to the remaining questions within the next few days. And I just also want to mention that if we do not have a current answer for your question, we may also save that question and add it to the frequently asked questions or FAQ that will be posted on our website. All right, so we'll move to questions. And what may be easiest here is if Meredith would want to read any questions that have come in, and then we'll try to answer them to the best of our ability in the time we have. If we can't answer a question, we will keep the question and try to answer that through a frequently asked questions, which we'll be posting on our website. It's also known as an FAQ, and that will be updated periodically if we receive additional questions. So just keep an eye on that FAQ as it can provide some additional information that may be helpful to you when writing the grant. So go ahead, Meredith, with any questions.
Okay, While we're waiting for Meredith, I can step in. There's a couple questions that I see. One is asking if
Sorry, Nancy, I think we lost you.
Can you hear me now?
So I can, yeah.
Okay. I do want to say that I've noticed in the chat that there is some poor audio, and we do sincerely apologize for that. The presentation will be posted on our website, and there will be continued opportunity to ask questions that we will respond to on the frequently asked questions. So the first question, Diane, is outreach and navigation considered administrative?
Yes, doing the marketing and like housing navigation service would be under the administrative expenses. So that would be part of that cap of 15%.
Another question. Are
Yes.
there restrictions on eligibility for households who are already receiving other types of housing assistance, such as a federal or other rental subsidy?
So the program intends to serve households who are not typically receiving the rent assistance, such as Section 8, because that would adjust according to income. There are, every once in a while, there's an exception to this. If for some reason that situation would occur, I would contact us directly and we can work through that for you. But most of the time, if a household is receiving rent assistance that is in accordance with paying, in accordance with their income, then they would not be eligible.
Another question. For mortgages, do you require that homeowners with mortgages try to obtain special forbearance, loan modification, and or repayment plan?
So we will be asking a question about whether the household is receiving any other types of assistance. And so if they are going to be receiving other types of assistance for the same emergency, then we would not allow payment for that if they were receiving another type of assistance. In the circumstance where they're seeking assistance, but they're maybe on a waiting list and have not yet received assistance, for example, then that would be different. You could serve that household if they have not received payment for that emergency already.
Okay, what reporting is required, and is it monthly reporting? And I can answer that question that is yes, it will be monthly reporting that's required. And there are dates that those reports will be due that are listed on the timeline that was provided on this webinar. And then Diane, is there a limit of assistance per household?
There is no cap on assistance. And the thing to pay attention to is really the time frame that the funds can be used for past due bills that occur between March 1st and December 30th. And of course, those are housing related costs that are past due. So that in and of itself may limit how much assistance you can provide.
How do you calculate the number of households you may serve?
This is a great question. We hope to have some data available for you on our website. We're hoping to post that tomorrow on Friday. That'll give some geographic data and demographics that might be helpful to you, such as the unemployment in that particular area. I think that can help you determine which households or how many households might be at risk in your geographic area.
There is a question about asking if undocumented individuals eligible to receive, are they eligible to receive housing assistance through this program?
That is a good question. I apologize, my my notes fell down, of course. So hold on. So to qualify for the program, individuals will need to verify two things. One, that they've fallen behind on their rent or mortgage or other housing expense due to the public health emergency of COVID-19. And the second is that they meet the income requirements. Outside of the potential geographic limits related to the service area, no other eligibility requirements are permitted.
Can households make applications to any approved administrator, or do they have to apply to an administrator approved for their specific geographic area?
So our intent with, and I'm not sure I'm going to answer this correctly because I'm not exactly sure of the question, but our intent is that we would be providing statewide coverage with this program, and that if a household made a request of an administrator to receive payment within that geographic service area, we would hope that they would be served, even if there might be another administrator that's, serving in the same region. If someone comes to that administrator door, we hope that that household would be served by that administrator. The goal is to try to make it easy for constituents as possible.
Here's one more question. We want to submit a proposal with multiple partners. Please explain whether an RFP is needed to select them. Do RFP requirements change depending on whether partners are selected before or after the application is submitted?
So I will give you my understanding of this, and then we'll clarify it in one of the questions in the FAQ. My understanding is that partners may apply together at the beginning of the grant if they are known partners, so you know the names of all the folks that are applying with your application, and that is acceptable, and there is not a specific RFP requirement for that. So if they're known entities, that is how you would go about applying. If you apply but do not know the entities that are going to be your partners, then at that point, once an award was provided, you would be required to conduct an RFP process for the other partners that you want to solicit. So by the nature that we have in this situation of it being incredibly fast speed to the end, we encourage you to have known partners at the beginning of your grant process to the greatest extent possible, because it will be very challenging to try to conduct any kind of procurement or RFP process after you've submitted.
This can only be used for payments that are past due. What if mortgage payments have been deferred? Can these funds be used for already deferred payments?
So that question I might need more detail on, and if you can provide more detail either by emailing us or putting some more detail into the chat function, that'll be really helpful. I think that basically if a mortgage company has already worked out a situation with a client where they have made arrangements for the mortgage going forward, that would not be eligible. But if it is a situation where the mortgage company or the mortgage assister has not been contacted or they have not been served yet by seeking assistance, then it would be eligible as long as the bill is still past due.
When applicants need assistance, when will they be available? So essentially, I think, when will people be able to apply for assistance? So this is individuals who need the assistance.
Yes, our hope is that the programs will be up and running by August 10th. It's possible that some programs may be up and running prior to August 10th, but the goal is to have all programs that are funded statewide be operating by August 10th.
Can we apply for funding to help with utilities alone, or do we need to offer the whole array of expense options?
So our preference is that the programs would provide the full breadth of assistance to constituents in that geographic area. And this is where I think the partnerships become really critical. If you're able to work with other partners in your community that have the other areas of expertise, that can also strengthen your application.
How do you define service area in the case of a tribal entity? Would we provide service only to band members or to all those within our geographical area?
So that is a great question that I think I'm going to add to my FAQ. There are some circumstances where tribal nations can provide preference to tribal members. In general, our regular expectation of the program would be that households seeking assistance could be served through any program that covers that geographic area. But in the case of tribal nations, there may be the ability to have a preference. So I will research that and make sure I post an FAQ about it.
For income, I think this means verification. For income, what if your job is closed due to COVID and you're getting unemployment?
So the income requirements are fixed. It means that if you're receiving current income, including unemployment, that exceeds that 300% federal poverty guidelines, you would not be eligible. But if your income reduced, for example, those households that are receiving the additional $600, that is supposed to end in July, and then the income would go down, then in that circumstance, I would definitely check back to see if you're eligible.
So this is from a listener who is saying that she represents a statewide mediation organization that has been providing remote mediation services for the last 3 years. There's been a surge of remote services since the pandemic. And so they're wondering if there might be a statewide provider that might have an interest in submitting a joint application.
Thanks, Nancy. So are they looking for,
it sounds like I'm interpreting this, and perhaps you could add more information if I'm not interpreting this correctly, but it sounds like you might be putting a feeler out to other listeners on the call to gauge their interest in working with you to submit a joint application. And perhaps you can let me know if there's further details that you'd like to offer. But that's how I'm interpreting it. So while we wait for that response, if there is one, I'll go to the next question. Can funded navigation services also help direct clients to other funding as well as CHAP funding? Or must all assisted clients be CHAP eligible and receive CHAP assistance?
Yes, I think what will likely happen is that you'll receive applicants who want to participate in CHAP, but there may be circumstances that those households end up being ineligible, or maybe they receive some other type of assistance. In that circumstance, need to be referred to another program. So it makes sense that some of the work that you'll be doing as a provider is referral or referral to other programs or resources as opposed to working with a client that may not.
And excuse me, it does sound like somebody might not be on mute. So just a friendly reminder, if you're not talking to push your phone on mute because we can hear that background noise. If a person within our program doesn't have a late payment, but they will have a late payment, are they able to apply preemptively?
The program is intended to serve those with past due bills. So once the bill has gone past due, then they would be eligible to apply. And in looking at that just from a rental perspective, for example, the lease will outline when the rent is late, and I would use that date to determine if the rent is late.
Is there a guidebook for CHAP, and if so, the location? I will just briefly answer that to move things along. There is not, and we will be creating one. In the meantime, the place to get the most updated and relevant information is the FAQs. And this development of this book is high on our priority list, and so we will be making that available. Our households that have been cut in hours but still remain employed eligible. And then a second question of that is, what about those that were offered full-time positions, but now they're receiving a lower wage?
So the eligibility isn't tied to whether you're working full-time or part-time. It's tied to how much money that you're making. So it would be tied to the income that you're making within that given month. And the way that we calculate income is by looking at 1 month's worth of income and then determining if you have met the federal poverty guideline limit.
I assume agencies are making all of the payments to various entities and no electronic fund transfer payments. Is that correct? So essentially, are EFT payments directly to the recipient allowed?
So I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but if the funds are being provided for a payment of a housing bill, it would go to the entity that it was owed to. So the payment must be provided to the landlord, the mortgage company. It cannot be provided to the household.
Say if we do energy assistance and we do like electronic funds transfers, that's what I'm thinking about with the utility bills.
So I think I can take a stab at this. So if you have a provider that's already in your system and receiving electronic funds transfers payments, like for example, you may have a utility company set up because you work with households that need this type of assistance. If that is set up and that's the most efficient way for you to make payment, that would be you just want to make sure that you're keeping that adequate documentation. One thing that we look for when we're monitoring is evidence of fund payment to that entity. Will you require administrators to pull a credit report or a tenant report for households applying for assistance?
No, we will not be requiring that. Most of the documentation related to, for example, showing that they're COVID-19 impacted will be self-certification. For income documentation, we will be requesting documentation such as pay stubs or an employer verification of income. And if that can't be secured, then we also do allow self-certification of income in some circumstances. But we won't be requiring additional information such as a credit or background check.
When will client applications, when will we be able to see the client applications?
So at this time, the providers will receive awards and be up and running around August 10th and be able to take applications from clients. We do anticipate that we will be providing a common application form or assessment form for clients to fill out, and that our providers will use the same form in order to make that assessment. So we will be providing the form that will be needed to do this assessment?
I just received notice we have 2 minutes left, and so any questions that we don't get to, we will post on our website and we will provide responses. Are utilities included for possible assistance? The answer to that is yes, it is an eligible expense, although the invoice must be past due and dated March 1st or later. Is it allowable for tribes to offer this assistance to renters of tribal-owned units? And the second question, is it allowable to offer this assistance to those whose lender is the tribe for their mortgage?
Yes, that would be allowable for any of the bills that are past due and have not yet been paid. It would not be allowable to pay rent that's already been paid by a tribal nation, but it could be used for rent that's past due. And of course, the other discussion that we had about if they're receiving some type of rent assistance that's income-based, then that household may be ineligible because that assistance should adjust according to income. So I hope that this has been helpful to you, and we really appreciate your participation. We clearly had a much higher number of applicants interested in attending the webinar than we anticipated, so appreciate you sticking with us through some of the technical difficulties. And again, we'll post this on our website, and please continue to email us with any questions that you have. Thank you.